I'll go straight to the next panel because here's where we will start working on one of the main FAR 2022 axis, because this main axis is rehabilitation in this case, also linked with industrialization with the title Industrializing to Better Rehabilitate. I will now give floor to Anna Ramos, director of the Mies van der Rohe Foundation in Barcelona, who will be presenting Christophe Hutin, architect of the project for the rehabilitation of the Grand Parc de Bordeaux with La Cetton Freddy Trois, and they won the Mies van der Rohe 2019 prize, the award, and it generated a high impact. It's still being studied in the universities of architecture. This session will be done in French, so you can get a simultaneous interpretation receiver if you need a simultaneous interpretation from French. Thank you very much.
Pardon. Us presento, bueno, la Núria Moliner.
Nuria Moliné has already introduced them. Christophe Hutin is a part of the team of architects who, together with Fasano Drouot, were responsible for the Mies van der Rohe Award 2019 with a rehabilitation of 26 housing units in Bordeaux, a rehabilitation that was putting into practice the famous never demolish, thus saving this building with this project, which also is an extraordinarily attentive project, attentive to the realities of the community that were lived in the building. He was a curator of the France Pavilion in the Venezia Biennale, also in Chicago. He's a really interesting person, and I'm sure it will be a pleasure to listen to him.
Thank you. I apologize because I don't speak Spanish or Catalan enough, but thank you for inviting me to Barcelona. Thanks to the City Council to discuss a topic which is of urgent, and I am delighted that you are talking of the city of Barcelona, because in slightly less than 10 minutes I'll try giving my presentation. So let's travel now to Bordeaux. I think you may know it. It's a city that was largely built in the 17th century. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site, which has then a circle of modern 20th century buildings, which you can see at the bottom of the photo, and this is what we are talking about. The work I'm presenting was done by a team with Jean-Fel Bassal and Frédéric Moreau, and we, at the end of 2009, I think, we worked for the metropolitan area of Bordeaux on a program called 50,000 housing units. The idea was to come up with strategies to build and housing units, linking them to transport infrastructure and with the public investments that had been made. So this was an urban strategy that needed to be defined. Our goal was quite clear and quite simple. The idea was that in Bordeaux there are 161 collective housing units, and we had an inventory of all of these collective housing in France. The urban planning policies follow the ideology of demolishing. Since in the last 25 years, they've demolished more than 100,000 public housing, which was built with public money, which I found quite dramatic. So we had to come up with an inventory of the social housing, collective housing units. The idea was quite simple. Instead of building new neighborhoods by cutting down trees and demolishing everything and having an eco neighborhood, we said we want to look at the city as it stands, and we want to add housing units to be able to refurbish the public investment so that they can use for everyone to benefit from an urban strategy, instead of dedicating all the money to building new neighborhoods. And this was the occasion to look at what wasn't working. When things work well, not much is needed So we defined this principle of urban situations that were capable. I mean, in each situation, we could add new housing units, and I repeat, with the goal of refurbishing housing on site that may have been degraded. The idea was to start with the city as it is, to look at everyday things. The city of the future is a slogan, yes, but we have to look at the city as it stands today and the way in which we live in our cities. This situation offer a huge potential of creation in the sense that each situation, each place, the way people live and must lead to a project that is specific and unique to that area. These industrialized processes are okay as long as they can be used to meet to the complexities that come with the way in which people live. So following this urban study, we created a case study. So we worked on 3 buildings, the 3 largest buildings that you can see at the back and the right. These were buildings built in the 60s. Nowadays we wouldn't build neighborhoods with these infrastructures. It's a bit brutal, I must recognize, but it was still a solution of housing that was interesting in terms of weather. And I think these, they did work for 50 years. These buildings housed families and came up with housing solutions to people who maybe lived in conditions that weren't very hygienic. So the urban renovation comes with the demolishment of these buildings to build smaller buildings, but when it comes to the distribution within the apartments, it doesn't change much. So these are the buildings affected, and the project that we carried out in the early 2010, we were handed this building in 2016. So this is the status it was before the project, and this is the type of architecture that we don't like in France. The popular neighborhoods where there's 730 inhabitants. The city council said we would demolish these buildings, and thanks to a project with the owners and the owners of these buildings, we were able to say, okay, well, let's look at refurbishing these buildings to offer better housing, but keeping the buildings. What we must understand and see here is when you have a politician who decides to demolish a building, and this is something that has been concerning me for several decades, I don't know why they decide to demolish these buildings. Probably because they look at them from a faraway position. So they look at these buildings in relation to the rest of the city and saying, okay, it's a long bar or it's a tower, but there are 730 families living inside. And when you're from the outside and you look at this, you look at this building as an inner mass. But when you go inside the building and look at inside I met the tenants in these apartments. We took pictures. There are 130 wonderful worlds and lives that people have maintained. They've taken care of their apartments. They have decorated. They've written their personal stories there for 40 or 50 years. And that has a value in architecture. Very often when we look at construction, but for me, the goal is to allow people to have a project of life. It's difficult to have their life project in social housing because it's managed and it's temporary sometimes, but people always find a way of decorating the architecture and making it in line with their life project. That's what's interesting. So we have 130 small worlds, and going into the matter, you can see that when you see this big mass of cement, when you go inside, it's not the same. People write their stories. I'm not judging the aesthetics or what we find in these apartments. In any case, what we see there is their happiness, their personal stories, their moments of sorrow. That is what is interesting for us. So Here we have maybe a Moroccan family. We can see from the way in which they have furnished their house. But these housing units were conceived in a functional way, so with certain uses. We're always forced to live in the way in which the architect has designed the apartment. So here's what we did. These 130 apartments, we expanded them. We transformed one apartment and we replicated 130 times, and that is where the industrialization process can help us. So what do we do with an apartment? We added a space. This space wasn't planned, wasn't functional, it was indeterminate, it doesn't have a specific use, and this space opens up to the extent. The red facade, we took it away and we added 4 meters of a balcony with enclosures and a meter of balcony. So this is what you can do with an apartment. If I take an example here, we are apartment with 2 bedrooms. On the left it's functionalist. We have 2 bedrooms, a sitting room, a kitchen, and then there's a corridor. With the extension we have new possibilities of moving around the apartment. We see this image when you live in France. If your mother tells you off, you can always find an escape route. So you can move around this apartment in a new way. You can reorganize it, and instead of being a house with an external space, it allows you to regulate temperature and the notions of comfort, which are managed by the users and not by the system. The architecture, I mean, the topic of today is about industrialization, and the issue of architecture, the way we build, is usually in the way of industrial products that are manufactured by hand. So we need to use the industrialized products in very complex situations. So this is one of the winter gardens, that of Jean-Yves. His winter garden is beautiful. He's put many plants there. You can see the new facade. Here we have the new windows, the glass windows that limit the space, and then it gives onto this space, and then a last layer which allows us users to regulate the temperature in their room. I forgot to say, so let me go back to this other slide. The apartment is 58.8 square meters. With the new floor surface, it's 118.9. So this means that we did this at a cost of 50,000 euros per housing unit. No one does this nowadays. No one builds 118 square meter 2-room apartments. I mean, the old building has a huge potential that we had to use. Okay, so here's the floor plan of one of the buildings. We have the ground floor with the new corridors. We rebuilt lifts, and an important point, which is the work was done in a place that was being lived in, with people living in their apartments. It was important for us because the pictures I show you initially, you can see that people live in this building, and it wasn't a matter of making them leave. And then we added also on to the rooftop. So this is the process. We used prefabricated concrete modules. It was at a site 1 kilometer away to construct these new concrete floors, and here you see the image of the building once it had been transformed. Obviously it's much more modern. There are several things, and people can also look out, and it helps them regulate the temperature. So we are talking of prefabricated slabs. We wanted to reduce the nuisance in terms of noise and dust. We banned machinery. Everything was manufactured up front, and here you see that it's industrial, but it also matches the complexity of the situation where everything is different. So here we see the slabs, they're being set, so the operators can move on to the slabs. We didn't need any scaffolding because they had this balcony, so they could start working immediately. It took around 7 days of consecutive work for each additional slab. And here we see the pillars. Here we have the walls. Here you have the construction lift to carry materials. Then we have the completed winter garden or the conservatory. So here we see the only moment where they used machinery. You can see the size of the blade. They had to cut, and there was, I mean, so we had temporary closures to allow people to stay in their house with some natural light. It only took 1 day to cut these holes in the slabs. So here we have the test. This woman was watching the TV while we were working on the outside with that cutting disc. And here we have the end result. So this space doesn't have a predetermined use. People can give it the use they wish, to live in the space the way they like. And by this, what I'm trying to say is that when I define an architecture project, it has to match the skills of the designers and the architects and the way in which inhabitants live. They transform architecture. They can adapt it to the way in which they want to live. And that is why very often architecture is adapted by those who live in it. And I think it's a valuable asset. And we need to make an indeterminate space, a place with no determined use, so that people can do what they want in those spaces and turn it into what they want to turn it. So here we see these winter gardens where every family gives it a different use. And then here we are in a city which is quite flat. If we had demolished these buildings, we wouldn't have such clear views because the current municipal regulations wouldn't allow for such a high-rise construction. And imagine, you know, working here and looking out at these views. And it's very pleasant living in this. For the demo, we wanted to show that we can build additional housing units on the rooftop of this building as a way of refurbishing. They go from back to front. They have views for all the city. They're quite wonderful in terms of location, obviously. And then if we look at the downside, we were very proud to be the recipients of the Mies van der Rohe Prize in 2019 for the refurbishment of this building, which I would never have imagined to receive this prize. I'd never have guessed that one day I'd be in Barcelona at the with a Mies van der Rohe. And before that, I want to show you an apartment. It's a video. It's owned by a woman called Aurelia Ramos, who's been living in that building for more than 40 years. So we'll show this video of the inside of her apartment. It's a short video that will take us to the end, and with that you'll be able to take a tour of what the apartments look inside, because otherwise you only have the perspective of politicians who are very far from the realities on the ground. So these are the concrete placards that were installed, 6 or 7 a day. The operators are at the top waiting for the concrete slat to be put in place, and then we want to, once they were in place and all ready, we wanted to hand them over to the inhabitants of the apartments as quickly as possible so they could start using them. It took us 2.5 years to refurbish 530 apartments. Okay, so Aurelia Ramos, who's the tenant living here, will take us on a tour of her apartment. It's great that they've come up with this initiative. I see work that's been very well done. It's beautiful, and that's where I live. Most of my spend most of my time. Before I was closed up and locked up in here. You were here. You had little small windows where you couldn't see anything. But when I'm out here, I can look at people working. I can water my plants. I do everything. I live out in this space. I live with my flatmate. I go out and whether it's hot or cold, I can meet my neighbors. And for a long time, and I can go out and sit here, and it's a different life. My life changed. I'm outside. I can move to the other smaller balcony if the weather's nice. I can say hello. I can watch people doing their life, or then I can go into the garden. Okay, thank you. That's all on my side.
Thank you so much, Christophe. And we will have the chance of asking him questions if you want. And we will do that through your system.
Invitació en nom de la Fundació Mies van der Rohe, organitzadors del Premi.
The Mies van der Rohe Awards it is a pleasure for any European architecture to be present here in a conference about the creation of housing with dignity and the contribution to the existing heritage. It is not only a contribution by European architects, but all European architects feel this has to do with them. So this is probably what's different here from other regions in the world. The Mies van der Rohe Foundation was created in 1983 by the City Council of Barcelona with the initial goal of reconstructing the German pavilion, originally planned by Mies van der Rohe and the Rhine, for the International Exhibition of Barcelona in 1929. Apart from preserving and disseminating the building, as well as the modern movement of architecture, the foundation is creating knowledge and training about urban architecture, especially in the context of the paradigms and shifts of paradigm in fundamental concepts such as inclusion and sustainability. Among other activities, it's not the same picture that Mr. Hutin was showing, but it's the same day. Our research, debates, artistic events. In this case, one of the recreation of these Bordeaux apartments was recreated within the Mies van der Rohe pavilion. The pavilion is so big, it's as big as one apartment with its extension. We are organizing the Mies van der Rohe Awards since 1988, one of the most prestigious awards in Europe, recognizing the best built architecture on European soil for offices, by studios in Europe. National associations of architecture from 41 countries are listing a list of 19 experts renovated every 3 years, and they are having 15 museums all around Europe as well, and making up a total of 400 works. An independent jury at each edition, made up by a mix of architects, museum directors, and some other experts, non-architects, so for example, an ex-politician who, through architecture, wants to make the lives of the citizens better and who's trying to make the connection. So all of this jury does a pre-selection of 40 projects, the shortlisted projects, which are later forming an itinerating exhibition all around Europe. After that, there are 5 finalists, or 5+2, 5 for the absolute category and 2 for the emerging architecture category. And this is the visit that the jury made in March, February-March 1920 in Bordeaux. It was cold. We had the pleasure of seeing firsthand what Mr. Hutin was telling us about. And there's something that you might not have noticed, but there's an extraordinary quality in the execution of these works in every detail. The sliding systems, the polycarbonates, the multiplicity of layers, the richness of layers, which made Miss Anna Ramos, who is not a relative of mine, by the way, but which allowed her to rediscover the fact that she used to live in a tiny apartment before, and now I have a house with a garden, she was saying. She was also better able to establish a relationship with the weather, the changing weather, the seasons, and only by adding this big balcony, then that meant you could come closer to your neighbor and have a chat with her. And before that, it was just popping your head out of the window, and it was harder to do that. And the generosity of the space, the dimensions of it, 58 to 118 square meters. So it was done, and it was done well. And so this would be the motto, and this is what the jury discovered in this project. It was done, but it was done well. This would be one example of one of the exhibitions. These 40 shortlisted projects are asked to present models, maps, designs. A total of 4,000 works are being presented, of which 500 are presenting models, originals. And this archive is being used as a research tool so that we can delve into issues that can be of interest sometimes. What was the issue of interest at the specific moment was a coincidence, because in 2017 and 2019, in 2017, the jury chose as a winning project an intervention in a housing block in Amsterdam, Clayburg, which was going to be demolished. And that intervention avoided its demolishing, and also it gave it a new life. That's the red color. And after 2 years, in 2019, the winning prize was the Bordeaux project, a big housing project, which was about to be demolished as well, but it was saved thanks to the joint work of architects, but not just architects, urban planners, economists, staff who was working in public administration. All of them were needed, and all these broad complicities were needed in order to achieve this turning around of these ways in which society sometimes work. And this was a great success because it was the visualization of an exemplary project so that others could learn from it and apply those learnings in their own professional practice. So it was clear that 2 different independent juries had a common ground. Architects, colleagues, and society in general could discuss and debate about the transformation of these big blocks. La Cité de l'Architecture et du Urbanisme in 2020 cured an exhibition called The Transformation, a big scale of the big challenges of sustainability. This exhibition was in Paris, then it traveled to Cannes in the framework of the Biennale, and then it was in Madrid in 2022 at the International Forum of the Architectural Union of Architects, the Forum of Belt Housing Activation. If anybody wants to have a next and wants to host the next stop for this exhibit, just please say so. Francis Lambert, the director of the Department of Architectural Creation of the Cité d'Architecture et Urbanisme, offered to revisit those spaces in order to revisit them. The big blocks in France and in other places in Europe are not loved, not appreciated. Parallel bars, pieces of cities that are inspired in the Athens chart, which 50 years later are giving signs of fatigue and of abandonment. Born as an answer to an era of demographic and economic growth, these blocks of housings would have disappeared already if architects, promoters hadn't decided to fight for them, if they hadn't decided to rebuild instead of demolish or destroy. For the exhibition, Ivan Blasi and Anna Sala, the curators of the exhibition, a part of the Mies van der Rohe team, created this graph, which speaks about the life of some of the examples of these great buildings. We have an extreme case of the Mingue building in Lyon, which survived for 29 years. After 29 years, it was decided to demolish this building because it was considered that it was obsolete. And the most bleeding case had been the demolition of the Robin Hood Gardens in London, which had place in 2017 because it was considered that those buildings were guilty of the evil suffered by those neighbors. But it's maybe it's not so clear that this is the case. Maybe maintaining or rescuing what's good in buildings while improving what can be improvable could be a better solution or a better way. Now I would like to tell you a little bit about the Kleiberg project. Maybe it's not so well known. This project was about encouraging the individual dreams. This proposal proposed one of the greatest renovations of one of the biggest Dutch buildings in the Basque Country called Kleiberg, the 500-apartment block, 400 meters long and 11 floors high. Built in 1971, 40 years later, it was taken out on auction and sold for €1 because the owner of the building, who had thrown out all the problematic tenants, and he had emptied the building. It was much more expensive for him to demolish it than to sell it. The sales was associated to a feasibility plan, and this feasibility plan was what Enel Architects with the Isnel Abel architecture team of architects together with a team of lawyers and economists and experts in marketing as well, because it was a whole interesting bet saved the building. How did they save it? Through the concept do it yourself, Klusvlak in Dutch, which meant that whoever bought the building would do the renovation himself or herself, but not the whole renovation. Whatever came industrialized was what came in was the main structure, the whole concrete and forged railings, concrete railings, as you can see. These horizontal railings are structural. They are made of concrete. And the pillars, all of this was left. The elevators were placed somewhere else to improve the distribution. The passages and the perimeters was done by the promoters of the project. And the frames were also maintained. But then there was an industrialization for the renovation of facades. There was a master plan and different models for it with different layers so that you could have a different facade for your apartment according to what you wanted. Therefore, the important interventions were the following, and that was done at big scale. The tenants or the buyers, because there were different ways of occupying their house, could occupy their 80 square meters in the 7th floor that they were renting, in the 1st floor or 8th floor, or that they were buying. This has to do with the way in which we intervene in a big building like this. The vertical nucleus were relocated in the inside of the building, which allowed us to restore the beauty of this horizontality, which was radically powerful because the exterior nucleus had been incorporated later. Circulation was improved with it was a barrier of 400 square meters, which made it difficult for spaces to be circulated. So big holes were made so that the building was able to be crossed from one side to the other, and it was also improving the safety of the urban environment. All the storage places and dead spaces were accumulated in the ground floor, but they were relocated in the vertical nucleus around where the elevators used to be, and that's where in the ground floors were converted into duplex apartments with an exit out on the street, which was a whole revolution in terms of the relationship between the building and the outside. As you can see here in this image, the maximum profit of the beauty of concrete was taken in. It had in the past been painted in different colors to avoid it from being ugly, avoid it to be ugly. But this concrete was sprayed by sand to obtain this Torrentino effect. And this cascade of elevators allowed the beauty of these corners and these inner passages, and which were generous, broad, just as we were saying it was generous in the case of in Bordeaux. It had to be big, high, with windows. The duplex houses in the ground floors also have big windows looking out on those passages so that the eye can also see what's going on in the street. And these passages all alongside the buildings are ways to reach your balcony, to reach your apartment, but they are also access paths, and they all have a private balcony on the back. This exhibition gathered 3 housing projects in the city of architecture along the Mies Rohe project. Housing is the main activity of architects all throughout Europe, maybe in 80%. However, they are underrepresented in the architecture awards, in the big architecture awards. Other types of architecture are being given more protagonism. This is why the decision on the 2017 and 2019 award decision was so important. We asked Josep Maria Montaner and Saida Moshi to write some of the texts for this exhibition. I will quote them, and I'm translating from French now. The examples, the emblematic examples of big groups of collective housing have been generally studied in the phase of a project or in the phase of construction and opening, but very few times, very seldom have they been studied. Very seldom has it been written about the way in which each of these buildings has evolved and has adapted to the life conditions of the people occupying them. This is the extraordinary task that was carried out by Christophe Hutin, understanding how people are living inside of these buildings. And this is about how houses are made in order to be inhabited. Their maintenance and their capacity of adaptation are essential. And collective housing in modernity, the modern collective housing, is a living heritage from which we can extract lessons if we take a look and we pay attention to how people are living in these spaces. Now I'll take a leap to the 2022 edition of the award, the prize, and I will focus on the local scale, Barcelona, Catalonia. Housing projects. The Laborda project in Barcelona from the cooperative La Col, which was selected as a winner in the category of emerging architecture. The social housing project, which was a finalist for the Misma de Rohe Prize in Cornellà de Llobregat. Work by architects Peris Toral with indeterminate spaces. Very important what Christophe Hutin said. Among the shortlisted, the transformation of an old industrial building converted into a house, work by architects Roldan Berenguer. Anna will continue with nominees. A building for social housing in Sant Boi next to Barcelona, Estudio Herreros and Mem Arquitectos. Block 6x6 in Boscap de Ferro in Girona. In this case, it must be said that it was a private project, but this promotion was also innovative. And still in Girona, also private initiative, an old office building at the center of the city converted into housing. Other typologies. Casa Burés, vom dir arquitectura. In the center of Barcelona, a project that didn't become a hotel, but it was kept as housing, which is one of the challenges we have in the city, which was quite a success. And the rehabilitation of another housing project, which was converted in order to maintain this use of housing by Bora Arquitectes, also in the center of Barcelona, at a smaller scale, much smaller. I decided to end with this image, which is far from big industrialized rehabilitations, because maybe I would like to start our discussion today with Christophe. I will ask him one or two questions, and then we will open up to the audience. And I know it's almost time for lunch.
So if you have headsets, I'll be speaking in French. My question is for you is, when we look at the scale of industrialization, to what extent can we talk of industrialization when talking of refurbishing? What are we going to do with these small or large buildings that are built in very different ways with many different forms of construction that are in a city? Is it easy to industrialize? Not always. You have to do things properly. But was it easy to industrialize a large apartment block like yours, but would it be easy to industrialize the rehabilitation of a small building in the city town? Going back to the large-scale project in Bordeaux, the potential to refurbish this building and turn it into another one came from the way in which had been constructed in the 60s, which was already industrialized. It was very straight lines. It was like a bar. There was a system of on rails that could build quickly and cheaply. So it was built originally with an industrialized system. So for us, it was clear that the way to transform this building also had to be done industrialized. So we extended the story. No, it was we using modern techniques, but we still had to do it in an industrial way. Now, in many cases, I think architecture as industrialized things, when you look at the size or the scale, I'd put it in relative cases. We know that windows, doors, frames are industrial, so we can apply the industrial scale to wherever we want. And also architecture has to do with industrial design. In smaller projects we can have industrial projects, but the important thing is that we cannot replicate a system like what we did in Grand Parc Bordeaux. We couldn't apply that same system to small buildings in Barcelona a priori, but maybe you could adapt it. So what we do, and I'm defending my profession, it's the work of architects, and it's up to their skills to adapt processes to complex situations that are technical or constructive, but also who have a social, human, and economic dimension to them. So I think we need to look outside the box of industrialized processes to open up to complexities and how to manage all of these complexities in each situation. Okay, so we saw that you had this map to look at where you could intervene. So that would be the other side to my question. So if you detect that you can intervene industrializing a specific type of buildings or with using a type of constructive system, maybe you need to look for buildings who are similar and then carrying out a mapping. Would you recommend starting off with a mapping exercise, saying yes, this could work here, it could work there, so let's look for other similar buildings where we could replicate this? Or how should we proceed on a large scale here in Barcelona? Well, I mean, first we could say that the starting point is to know what the real situation is like on the ground, having as much knowledge as possible. And for this, you have to visit. If you work on a master plan, you always end up considering things in a simplistic way by the shape. But if you want to go into the complexity of things, I think there's a great potential there, because cities are never homogeneous. They're heterogeneous, and this offers a potential for creation, because each building you want to refurbish gives a potential for creation, in my opinion. I never like to start off from a blank page when looking at art. The more complicated and complex the situation is, the more interesting it is. So maybe when we have this inventory to know what's going on in the ground, we realize that there are places where we can invent processes and ways of doing things that can allow us to take the story of each place in each situation further. And I'd say it's better having 1,000 architecture projects than a master plan. That's my advice. That's really interesting. We've had some questions from the audience.
The building improvements before and after completion in Bordeaux. En français.
Alors la réponse,
Well, the answer given by the tenants, well, they were happy to live there. I mean, the photos and videos I show you how people used to their benefit this additional space. But to go into maybe some more technical aspects or facts, what I can say is that in the question they're asking about before and after. I mean, before, when we look at this situation, and I guess it's universal, people are unhappy with the way they're treated and their living conditions. They complain of the quality of their housing, that it is rapidly degrading. So when you reach a context like that for a project, it's not easy. There is a lot of past frustration, but when you act on the present, I mean, I don't want to solve problems from the past or from the future. I want to work on the present situation. And we need to look at this. What we did in Bordeaux was something very simple, but yet very efficient. At the start of the project, there was an apartment on the first floor, which was empty. So we built a prototype from the start. And instead of paying people to convince others of the idea, all you have to do is show them what you've done with this prototype. I didn't have time to spend an hour meeting with each of the families. So even if I went to visit their apartments, we built this prototype where you had all of the fittings and the curtains. It was open all day, all evening. People could come in and take a look and touch around to see how things worked. And when we started, we had a rule. We needed more than half of the tenants signing a contract accepting the project, and 80% accepted. I think this was thanks to the prototype. People are smart, and they saw that they would benefit from this project. So we didn't need to convince them, they just simply accepted. And then as we're looking at the whole building, yes, it came with some nuisance, but we did everything we could to disturb them as least as possible and to leave space quickly so that they could see the benefits. And things went well. I mean, this was a building where 20% were vacant. The owner, I don't know, had to wait for 8-10 people to visit. And now when there are any vacancies, they have new tenants in them immediately. Okay, the other question was how... The question is...
to use high-level industrialization, like modulars, and high level of adaptability. And yeah, so how do we mix together high industrialization and high adaptability?
Ben, les facteurs auxquels il faut payer attention, c'est l'humain.
Well, we have to pay attention to the human aspect, people. That's what the only thing that counts at the end. It's people. So we don't have to adapt to the industry. Industry has to adapt to everyday life. Otherwise, it won't come with benefits. I love hearing you say that. Okay, so I don't know if there are any other questions from the audience. Yes? Apologies, the interpreters aren't able to hear the question. We would need a microphone. Apologies, the interpreters are not able to hear the question asked from the floor. Once again, the interpreters apologize, but they're not able to hear the floor. Well, what I can say is that we haven't had a second project. So are they still demolishing buildings? Yes, yes. In France, systematically they demolish buildings. In the outskirts of Bordeaux, there were 7 blocks built by Dubuisson in the 70s, and 870 housing will be demolished for 200 million euros, and there'll be less social housing than before. I don't know how this is acceptable. If I could have done differently, if I could have intervened to stop this, I would have done something different. Okay, I don't know if there are any other questions in the audience. If not, we'll leave it at that. Thank you very much. Thank you, Christophe, for being with us. And thank you so much. Thank you both for sharing these projects, these flagship projects with us. And Anna, thanks for giving visibility and for promoting these projects that are aiming at improving people's quality of life while reducing the environmental footprint through innovative construction materials and techniques, or through the refurbishment, which is one of the more sustainable ways we have. So now it's time for lunch and to recharge our batteries. This afternoon we will have very interesting discussions on topics such as speculation, gentrification, and rent regulation systems in Europe. So now you have time to go and have some lunch. You can take a walk around the neighborhood, and we will meet back here at 4:30. If you have any interpretation devices, please remember to give them back at the entrance of this room, and we'll see you very soon. Thank you.